WSU Vancouver's Council on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Academic Outreach and Innovation, ASLUSU, and WSU's Common Reading Program. I also wanted to take time to thank our VWS directors, Cameron McGill and Julian Onkney. Thank you all for making time to be with us this evening. Our common reading book this year was Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, which reflects upon modern-day botany as well as environmentalism through the perspective of Indigenous peoples of North America. Kimmerer offers a necessary perspective of how we can better face the challenges of our changing environment through multiple knowledge bases. Now, I would like to introduce my fellow VWS intern, Drew Ott, to introduce CMarie Fuhrman.
Thank you, Levi. CMarie Fuhrman is an author and poet whose work is rooted in the landscape of the West. She is the author of the collection of poems Camped Beneath the Dam and co-editor of two significant anthologies, Cascadia Field Guide, Art, Ecology, and Poetry, and Native Voices, Indigenous Poetry, Craft, and Conversations. She has published or forthcoming poetry and nonfiction in multiple journals, including Terrain.org, Emergence Magazine, Platform Review, Northwest Review, Yellow Medicine Review, Poetry Northwest, and several anthologies. CMarie is a regular columnist for The Inlander, translations editor for Broadsided Press, and the Elk River Writers Workshop director. CMarie is the associate director of the graduate program in creative writing at Western Colorado University, where she also directs the poetry program and teaches nature writing. She is the current Idaho writer in residence and resides in the mountains of West Central Idaho. Please give a warm welcome for CMarie Fuhrman.
Thank you so much, Drew. And thank you, Levi, for getting our evening started. I'm so excited to be here with two of my very good friends, Julian and Cameron, who are a big part of my story, and I'm forever grateful for their presence in my life. I'm also grateful to all of you, wherever you are listening to this, for allowing me into your homes. Zoom has made so many amazing things possible, but coming into your home and into your spaces is still an honor to me. So thank you for allowing me into those spaces. And tonight you're coming into my home as well, here in the Salmon River Mountains of Idaho, McCall, Idaho, just outside of Idaho. And I'm here with about 7 feet of snow on the ground, a fire going in the wood stove, and two very lazy dogs as an audience as well. So welcome into my home. I'm really glad you're here. I want to thank WSU and Cameron and Julian again for inviting me to be a reader this evening. All of you that have brought this together, Julian, thank you for sharing me with your class and your class with me. It was an honor to be in your class for that time and answer questions. And I also want to thank the South Fork of the Salmon River, because tonight we're going to take a trip down into that area. It's one of my favorite places on the map. And I recall several years ago when Native Voices came out, someone asked me, do you put the stories on the land, or does the land hold the stories and you find them? And I think that in this case, the land held the story and has given it to us tonight. And so I'm serving somewhat as a translator. I also want to ask you, as we're going through this, that when I ask you to do things with your hands, please do. It adds to the read of this and to seeing the South Fork with me, which I'm going to provide some photos to go along with, so you won't just have to stare at me and my plant collection throughout the evening. I'm going to go ahead and start that now. Get a better window of that. Here we go. Okay. Does that look okay? Great. All right. This is a story about a South Fork Salmon River logging road and what it means to be a good ancestor. And this is the story of a river, a road, and a fish. The river is the South Fork of the Salmon. More specifically, it is the stretch of the South Fork of the Salmon River that begins in a meadow named Stoley until it joins the Seasash River beneath my favorite bridge that curves in a way to suggest it is hugging the river, that curves like a comma, asking drivers to pause as they cross, to pause and look into the water below. Look in, as if there are answers there to our important questions. Look in because there are answers there. This bridge is not on the road that the story is interested in, but the road and the bridge and the fish that swim in the river are all on the way to the trail where the story begins. The trail, like the river, like the fish, predate white settlement. Yet it was worn by human feet. It is kept up now by hooves and paws, and on a day in late May of 2022, it knows the tread of my own soles, following the tread of my partner, the paws of my two dogs, and the notion of wonder. On this day, the hill we climb is golden with arrowleaf balsam root. I have known many flowers, but the balsam root, to my knowing, is most companionable. Iris of gold, pupil of earth, I am never alone when I'm walking among them, each greeting me from beside the trail, each eye watching my step, giving me glimpses in the soil that is the soul of all beings. Looking now into those brown eyes, I see ancestors, human and greater than, every being whose bone and ash fed the balsam root's bloom, fed the others that grow here too, fed the deer whose body fed my own. Once, before I stopped picking flowers, I tucked a stem behind my ear and for a moment gained another sight. In that moment, seeing through the soil color and gilded eye, I saw what I think I can call immutability. For a moment, I knew what was meant by the words, look to the lilies, how they grow. They toil not, nor do they spin. And for a moment, I toiled not, nor spun as well. But this morning, the one of our story, the one after I stopped picking flowers, choosing instead to hold them with my own eyes, sometimes a lens, let them grow and flourish to be breakfast for deer or vole, or just remain in poetry as the place where sunrises are born. This morning, I greeted them as I toiled up the steep trail, the very old trail, with my dogs, my man, and the song of robins above me, and the river and salmon below. To know the landscape of the South Fork of the Salmon River, hold your hands at heart level, palms down, spread the fingers of one hand and then the other, and weave them together, stopping at your first knuckle. Here is where the river winds through, still cutting the canyon that holds it. And there, between your fingers, are the drainages. We can name a few now, but know that names are mutable, and they have had many, and may have many to come. But today, let's call them Buckhorn and Camp and Phoebe and Nasty. And if you can imagine the landscape of your hands as big as mountains, like the Salmon River Mountains that hold the South Fork of the Salmon River, you will see how steep your fingers have become. What a travail it may be to get to the back of your hand. Oh, but what a gift the summit will be when you get there. The view notwithstanding, the back of your hand becomes a place to hope for, an easier walk, a rest. This is where we are headed, the back of your hand that is the summit and the ridge. Though, for the sake of our story and the stories yet to come, let's not name the drainage we walk, nor the creek that runs through it. Forgive my lie of omission, but trails like the one we are taking to the back of your hand are best left unnamed, just as some wishes are left unspoken if you want them to come true. This morning, the air is cool. It will rain. This, my partner, the fish biologist, tells me is salmon weather. And yes, There are salmon in the South Fork of the Salmon River, or soon they will be. And they are part of the story of river and road. But for the sake of the story, let's say they are more than salmon. Let's say they're a symbol for all life in the river, from steelhead to sculpin, mussel to lamprey. And the weather matters greatly to this story, particularly that it is salmon weather, because salmon weather means rain, and rain means that from the top and sides of the hills that we see in your hands, water will flow down, down, down into the streams and the sea sesh, and down into the South Fork of the Salmon River that flows down to the main Salmon River itself and is passing now, not too far from here, in a river called the Clearwater, which joins the Columbia and then the Pacific. And somewhere in that salinate water, right now, spring Chinook are turning their bodies east, turning their bodies back to fresh water, and carrying within those bodies food for the balsam root and black bear, and even the ponderosa, carrying life in its myriad forms in eggs or milt, carrying life back to the South Fork of the Salmon River. The salmon are carrying this life and their own story as they make their way upstream, a travail not like the short and simple walk up the drainage of our hands, but one that must overcome dams, resist currents, jump falls, to come to the headwaters where our story and the river began. Spring rain, spring snow, runoff, water. The banks of the creeks fill, even only if slightly. They rise in the sea sesh and the South Fork of the Salmon and the Main and so on down the line. And in times before the dams, before man opened gates, was gatekeeper to passage, the rising water made it easier for the salmon to maneuver around boulders, over falls, and make their way up thin streams and wrist-like tributaries to that place where even now lie the eggs that will soon hatch and the bodies that will grow, and eventually this salmon weather will be the spring water they ride down, passing us, passing their ancestors, passing the story on to a new generation. There is something else about the rain. When it falls, as soon it will, on the ridge and the drainage and the trail which we walked on that early May morning, it will loosen the soil. Snow knows this too. And that soil and rain will let go some small bits of earth, which will roll down the hillside, past the arrowleaf and lodgepole, to an old dirt road. And this is where our story may have stopped, because in this landscape and this story, the road begins to complicate things, like dams. It begins to disrupt a natural order, the downward movement. It disrupts relationship between slope and rain and river and fish. It is as if mid-stride, mid-step, me and the dogs and the fish biologist named Caleb freeze. As a photograph stills a moment. But it is more complicated than that, and yet it is also like pausing life, because those hillsides, like the salmon turning east in the Pacific, like me, giving you this story, are meant to give something to the river. This is what it means to be a good ancestor, to keep the gift moving. And the hill gives pebbles and duff and also boulders and entire trees. And this seems catastrophic. Sometimes a little catastrophe is necessary. Sometimes it takes an avalanche to feed a river the logs and boulders it needs to create homes and hiding for bull trout, beds for mussels, and to clean beaches and push debris downstream. This is their agreement. But the agreement was broken, or at least altered by the road where the rain has stopped. And with it came a new partner in the relationship, for the road was cut by a big yellow machine, not souls this time, not merely a path, but 6 feet of leveled earth. and instead of tread of sole, came tread of tire. The road played a part in a different kind of home. It was part of a web of roads cut into the fingers of hillsides, zigzagging back and forth, swaying as if dancing, and taking each tree it came to as a partner, shaking the dress of limbs and boughs until the final dip from a feller or saw from which the coniferous dancer never recovered. It was a dance of industry. The 1960s, the pride of lumberjacks who, I know, for I've met some, loved the South Fork of the Salmon River, loved these hills and the arrowleaf and pine as much as I do, as much as the Nimipu and the Tukadika, whose cambium peels are scars too. Love, we can agree, is as hard to define as Idaho itself. And perhaps best are both that way. Perhaps our love or the way we show it. Perhaps we found that we can love or at least need a thing too much. And so hundreds and hundreds of miles of roads were gashed into hillsides. Millions of trees were cut into board feet, and the slopes of the South Fork were as bare as the back of your hands, except for the roads. And when the big machines finally rolled away, when all the old trees were gone and the lumberjacks moved on and the stumps that thrust from the earth were fists or tombstones or just merely stumps exposing their years in a circle of circles containing old songs, containing ancient storms, circles like whorls in the print of your finger. And maybe, we don't know, as unique too. And though I was born after the roads, I have seen the South Fork of the Salmon without them. The first time in black and white, in a photograph buried in archives and uncovered almost as if by accident, but perhaps providence, for here is a haunting coincidence. The photographer who made the black and white photo, whose landscape I know, made the picture from the same trail where I stood in the tread of my partner, my dogs, the hooves and paws, and the footsteps of first ancestors. And not just the same trail, but exactly the same place. And the providence I talked about, the accident of finding, was a result of a search for a past I was trying to imagine, a past that included a homesteader cabin that, no matter its fortitude when it was built, is gone. No foundation or chimney or root cellar remain. I don't recall what I was hoping to find in my search, except that sense of wonder that comes with something so seemingly solid as a home, a life built into place, being suddenly so absolutely erased, as if it never existed, which does not surprise me, given our history and the way entire lives and cultures can be erased from it. So maybe it is not wonder that this missing achieves. Maybe it's something like hope, which is something that R.E. Benedict in 1904 might have felt when he stood where so many others had stood before, others unlike him, and where I would stand 107 years later. There was no trail and no road into the South Fork then, no gentle curve of bridge, no signs at stream crossing, no lookouts on peaks. There were no dams on the Salmon. Idaho had been a state for nearly 15 years, and the U.S. Forest Service was but a twinkle in Roosevelt's eye. But Teddy and Gifford had the wheels turning, and the photograph was taken by a man sent to scout for potential forest reserves. The label on the photo reads bull pine, yellow pine, and is not place, but trees, food for a growing nation. The photographer and his horses or mules, or horses and mules, his gear weighty and cumbersome, took this same trail up and set up his equipment first east, then west. I wonder what the trees heard in that moment when the shutter first clicked. Did the horses and mules flinch? Did the deer? Did the elk or flicker tense with prescience? Did the salmon? Was there a notion in that shudder of what was to come? And not that a landscape as dynamic as the South Forks does not change, but in that moment, did immutability have a new sound? Did it usher in a change unlike any ever seen in these mountains before? And so, with a click of a shutter, a new story began for the South Fork of the Salmon River, and in time, a new sound would fill the hills. First buck saws, then backhoes, and excavators, fellers, and semis. What once was just roar of a river would be covered by the sound of progress. Before I knew of the man and his camera, before the archives and the rain, I knew too was coming, the rain that brought us to this pause in the road. I had made pictures of my own, first east, then west. It was an outcropping of rock, a prominence, a place of view. And I stood atop it and paused because sometimes, because anymore, I am stilled by beauty. I am brought into a state of awe, sometimes to the point of tears. Tears that confuse me as much as they comfort me, for they seem not to know the difference between the beauty of joy and the beauty of pain. Or maybe it's because that we fear to lose beauty, for however we might define it, beauty gives us a sense of hope. And perhaps hopelessness may be defined as the absence of beauty. And maybe my tears are both afraid of what we found and what we lose. And so sometimes I hoard my emotion into a photograph. I collect the tears into a picture that I then pour out to friends, to myself over and over again, when solace seems so hard to find. And when I need to remind myself that there are places where, despite roads and men, despite conflicts and catastrophe, despite the longing of a river for her fish, the streams for their first names, despite what would come after the flinch of that first shutter, likely the very first shutter to close on these slopes. On the steep fingers that feed water and sediment and boulders and seed into the South Fork of the Salmon River, there is a place that I can turn to, even only if in a memory, where I stand on the edge of hope. And perhaps it is the immutability of the photograph, that Stacy's, that beauty gathered, that is evidence, that is necessary to prove there is something to be hopeful about. Is this what is meant by faith? Look to the arrow leaf, who do not spin nor toil. There's something else about the photographs, about looking into places where we can imagine, something Wallace Stegner wrote about in his wilderness letter when he wrote, "Something will have gone out of us as a people if we ever let the remaining wilderness destroyed." We simply need that wild country available to us, even if we never do more than drive to its edge and look in. He called it part of the geography of hope, and perhaps Benedict did too, and perhaps the loggers and miners and the homesteaders that came in and removed the Tukadika, Nimipu, the salmon, the wolves, the grizzly, the ponderosa, and how many others that had a different name or no name, a different story, or no story at all for this place. Saw something that looked like hope. The human-centric kind. The short view, the narrow view, like the photograph that can only hold so much, that can show only a bit of what matters to an entire landscape, to a future. For I believe that the wilderness to native people, native fishes, and even some poets is not so easily labeled, not so easily boundaried, was not wilderness at all, was simply an extension of life, like home. Maybe like the hands you use to make the landscape of the South Fork, something to be attached to, not separate from, no nature and not nature, just nature, just wilderness, nothing but home. And knowing this home existed and allowing it to exist meant human existence, meant life, meant that we too are part of the landscape, our wilderness, and that we had and what we had inflicted, what we were about to inflict, would cause us to lose more than trees and fish, would cause us to lose what we didn't know then was hope. I believe that most of those that would come in the half century after Benedict, the loggers, the CCC workers, the miners and homesteaders, did so with good intent. I like to believe that they took pride in their work. They were glad to have work and believed that their labors were part of a greater good. And those with children believed they would be remembered as good ancestors, making a better future for their children and those children to follow. I like to think that whomever drove the dozer that made the road that I am telling you about tonight told a story of progress in industry and frontierism to children who would look with pride at their fathers and mothers, trusting that yes, it was destiny. Yes, it would regrow. Yes, this land of plenty would always be. And yes, we were fair and did the best thing for those who had first called this canyon home. I have to believe that story in order to believe this one, the one I'm trying to tell you, the one that says we are capable of a great many things, the best of which may be making new stories. Come back with me now to the pause of the rain and earth on the road. Here, the earth and seeds that were tumbling with water stop. But rainwater, raindrops is a gift that is always in motion. So when the drop reaches the flat, it cannot shed as watersheds are bent to do, but gathers and pools on compacted earth, gathers and pools until it finds a slope enough to make a rivulet, carve runnels, and fall finally down. But in this new path, missing the roots it once fed, maybe feeding a different stream, and maybe the force of its gathering destabilizing and carrying more earth, more rocks and trees, more, and down into the river where reds of ancestors have been made for centuries. And those reds are flushed, and the eggs are lost, and the salmon return to empty beds, if they return at all. And in the years after the clear cuts, after the easiest trees were felled, the trees that shaded the river, kept cool the water for fishes, gave shade and eventually home, the land began to slide whole hillsides into water. And I say hillside because though tonight you and I talk about a small stretch of road, a single curve really, like the salmon that represent all the fish in the river, this piece of road is representative of over 800 miles of roads cut into the fingers and ridges, cut into the landscape that is an extension of home, cut in miles longer than those traveled by salmon that return from the Pacific to Stoli Meadows, which is long indeed. And if you can imagine that distance and the roads switched back and how the land then sloughed and slid, you know that more land went into the river than the river in all its wonder could manage. I understand this in poetry, which can bend to hyperbole, but this is not exaggeration, for I have seen it. And if I could tell you the way my partner has graciously told me, my partner, the fish biologist, Caleb, who has spent most of his career studying habitat, homes of salmon, I would give you the science of sediment. I would offer the facts and data, graphs with lines blue and red that would show distribution and declining numbers. I would show you too that though the lines stagger greatly toward declines and steeply as these South Fork Salmon River slopes to loss, there is something else happening. Some direct result of our being there, of cooperation, of the idea of healing. In those lines, a shift, however subtle, a river recovery, a rising line of hope. And for some, that might be enough. And for some, that may be the only story they need. but on a day in May on a trail where the souls of ancestors and treads of a man mostly forgotten to history, the paw prints and hoof prints and the tread of Caleb, then me, I found something that data can't measure, that no scientific experiment can track, something that my photo would gather and say perhaps be placed next to another, maybe by accident, maybe with a bit of providence, something that is almost forgettable, should be forgettable, a restoration, a restoration, a new way of being a good ancestor. Before the photograph and the ancestral trail, I had not known the South Fork of the Salmon River without the logging roads. I can recall my first glimpses, my finger pointing to the Z's on the slopes and Caleb's answer, it doesn't go anywhere. It was cut for logging. It goes to where the trees were and stops. And I could not understand, not fully, that a road would be built to nowhere. And in those early years, when I still hunted the canyon for deer, the roads were an easy way in. Dense and steep as the country is, the roads, what was left of them, was easy walking, quiet walking. But if there is anything a canyon abhors, it's a road. And so those that were closed, those forgotten, had begun to reclaim themselves. And walking then, though easier than the straight scramble up, meant climbing over down trees, meant squeezing through ceanothus, meant sometimes finding what loggers left behind. Of the hundreds of miles I have walked in the South Fork, many of them have been on old roads whose convenience and use had made them trails. And I was greedy to walk them, to see, to gain a deeper look into the heart of this wilderness. But I should have known that convenience isn't an offering of the canyon, that a contrivance of man, one made to take, would never give me the views I needed. For unwildness cannot lead to wild. When I was very first in love with the South Fork, I loved her roads and all. I let the contrivances be my convenience without second thought because I have rationalized that love is acceptance of what is. And I believe that if this could remain immutable, this landscape as I first met it, if no more change would come, no more holes in her sides, no more dams in her rivers, if the designations we'd placed by the institution we've placed faith in could protect the South Fork of the Salmon River, the streams and creeks, nasty buckhorn camp in Phoebe, the trail from being found out as a trail so ancient it aches with history. If we could protect this, keep it from changing, keep the tractors and plows and mining companies away, then maybe that would be love. Maybe that would show a little hope to predecessors. Maybe they would look to us with some pride and say, they did try. What I'm trying to say is that I fell in love with the South Fork despite its scarred hillsides. Because, I'm embarrassed to tell you, though I imagined things could get worse, I never imagined they might get better. This was my story of the South Fork and the roads, and I thought that despite what Caleb's research was finding, where research has been done and ignored before, that this was as good as it gets. And this I accepted. And I put my faith in places downriver, in time that dams would be removed, perhaps, that roads that were closed would stay closed and never tempt another clear cut, and that the ceanothus and ponderosa might cover our scars, as if ceanothus and ponderosa were some kind of thick paint. And in some photo 100 years from now, no one would see a road, and that the not seeing would be enough, just as I couldn't see what was to come in Benedict's photo, just as you could not see what is happening in mine. Wisdom, Stegner writes, is knowing what you have to accept. What I didn't know, what I couldn't see, was this was not the story of the South Fork we had to accept. What I didn't know was the reason Caleb had brought me to this old trail What I hadn't yet seen was a new story that was being written on the land. The story of the South Fork of the Salmon River, as you've seen, could be the modern story of many places in the West. The story after the story whose language was ignored. Settlers moved in, natives forced out, those who instilled fear from grizzlies to sheep-eater Indians were killed. Manifest destiny was invoked, and trees and rivers and deer and land were now named resource, were commodified. And a certain amount of greed settled in, and what once seemed bountiful, innumerable by the aforementioned sons and daughters of the loggers and miners, was taken by saw, by shovel, and by gun, was taken by dredge or drill, by single homesteaders and huge corporations, by government entities created to preserve, and then was either colonized or abandoned. In the areas that Benedict's photos made preserves, plans were written and promises made about caring for the land and serving the people, the which people it served, and how to define caring was mutable and only sometimes realized. In the areas that were abandoned because they offered no resource, Paul settled in. Lakes that offered no fish were labeled barren. Rivers reduced to reservoirs were stocked to attract visitors and became thick with algae and stale of story. And this says nothing of the people, those who call this homeland, those whose ancestors wore the trail in, people as resilient as the landscape and who, like the salmon, are trying, despite all the obstacles, to return home to natal waters through culture and language, both of which are dependent, not apart from, the landscape they are attached to as we to the back of our hands. And when looked at this way, when considering the entire West, a new story seems almost impossible. It seems sometimes that the only change can be for the worse. It seems that we are depending on someone downstream or down the years to fix what is wrong here and today. So when looked at this way, hope is an impossibility, and the fear of not knowing what the first ancestors knew, what Benedict felt when he set up the tripod in 1904, what Stegner meant with his words in 1964, and what I saw on that May morning, looking first east, then west, then back east again, is the fear I have as a future ancestor, is the fear that drove me to write this story, is a fear that if we do not create some amount of hope in both action and words, the only story we will believe is the one already written in roads on the landscape. I forgot to mention the Clarkia on the May walk. Do you know Clarkia? Such a deep purple and more than I had ever seen. I forgot too the ponderosa I wanted to mention. It stood alone on the hillside, 200 feet tall, a sentinel, a reminder. I have not known many larger. For most of the old trees, well, we've learned where they've gone. And even as this one was arrow straight and primed for the mill, it somehow was spared and housed beetles, held robins, and our backs as we leaned against it, eating our lunches, looking west. In its rings are the stories of thunderstorms and winters, the song of Nimipu and cry of osprey, the sound of wolves howling, and the shudder of Benedict's camera, and the sound of the saw, and now my sound too. In the heartwood of the DNA of the Pacific, in the heartwood is the DNA of the Pacific, delivered and spent salmon, shot by turkey vultures and eagles. In its bark is a nest of woodpeckers, and in its view is a landscape that, over the last century and a half, has been forced to change. And because imagination is part of my trade, I imagine the 1960s and a sire who saw this lodgepole, its location, its presence like a lighthouse, a beacon, and said, no, not this one. And the tree heard that too. And in that one word, a new seed was planted, an ancestor born, bearing something called hope. The rain, when it came, fell with a fervor, fell as if each drop had a job to do, was being deployed with a singular focus. The clouds threw the rain down, and despite our attempt to take shelter beneath the denser pine, the rain found us too. And in time, all I had protected with coat and hat was cold and wet. Rain dropped from the whiskers of the dogs, from the brims of our hats, and from the sides of our packs. Rain like tears on our cheeks. Rain chilled down our spines. Rain filling each crack and crevice it could reach. Rain finding roots and delivering life. Rain as salmon weather. The old dog stood in the rain like a challenge. The younger nosed his way beneath our bent legs, as if in his canine lineage, rain and dog were never to meet. And me, I thought of the water gathering in the river, gathering on the slope, water shedding off leaves and limbs and rock, and water watering the old pondo. Water at the top of the ridge carrying seed and some sediment, going down and down to that place where the first rain in our story stopped. But this rain fell down to the road, no longer a road, then down to the river, and did not stop. And when the storm passed, as storms are wont to do, and do quickly in this part of the Salmon River Mountains, and before the robin song returned, before the din of river rose up the hillside, I heard a sound that before would have frightened me, before would have been the opposite of hope. Through the trees and across our unnamed drainage on a hillside in the photo I took, what you cannot see, I heard the roar of the bulldozer's diesel engine as it caught and fired to life. It was the only sound, other than river and birdsong and thunder and soughing of trees we had heard all morning. It had been our constant companion on the trail uphill. It wasn't as loud as I imagined it would be, for I thought things of that nature, things of that ability, should and did come with quite a racket. It wasn't both present and distant, almost like thunder that now rumbled miles away, and though it brought no rain, its presence this time was welcome. And when I first saw it this morning, I gasped and pointed at its orange body, at its jaws and shovel. And this time Caleb just smiled and said, come, let me show you. Said a word I was beginning to look forward to hearing, said obliteration. When I first heard it, the word obliteration, I flinched. Obliteration sounded like destruction, and destruction is what I had come to fear for the South Fork of the Salmon landscape. The word sounded like destruction, and its result looked like destruction. When we reached the place where the old trail, the Indian trail, once met the road, I am overwhelmed by the smell of raw earth. I look west and see what is called obliteration, trees uprooted, earth upside down, soil tilled and mounded, rocks strewn without pattern, scrapes and pulls, and what could be called catastrophe if I didn't know what Caleb then tells me. Soon a woman toting a canvas bag filled with seeds, native seed mix, seeds of yarrow and bunch grass will come walking past. She will scatter the seed while others transplant ninebark and ceanothus into newly uncompacted soil that was only hours or days earlier road. She will walk east toward the river where I can see the giant orange excavator working its way down and down the ridgeline, down the old road. The compacted bed it tears up as it moves, pulling together road cut to road fill, pulling hillside to hillside together like seams of a wound. On occasion, the excavator will grab a root ball and all of a juvenile pine and place it into a hole it's left in the wreck. Then a rock, then another swipe above to pull below, leaving slope where shelf once had been. And for a moment, it is like I am watching time unwind, history in reverse, 6 feet an hour. And the irony of the Indian Trail meeting the road, the native seed planted in the uncompacted soil, the tribe and the government Benedict's photo, and now mine, Stegner's story of hope meeting mine, the irony of healing a wound, or maybe what looks like the metaphor for the beginning of a healing between ancestors new and old, was not lost on me. And when the excavator reaches the river, it will be driven to the top of another nowhere going road, and it will begin again and again until another 300 miles of roads are obliterated. And then, after the woman with her seed, the workers with their shovels leave the first prints in this fresh but not new soil, the land will be left to heal. The sound of the heavy equipment that has brought destruction and grace will reside in the rings of the Ponderosa. The rain that has fallen, the rain that gave us pause and chill, the rain that fell as if it had a job to do, will soak into the soil that is the soul of all things in the South Fork of the Salmon River. Will make its way to seed, to root, and it will feel something like I felt the first time I saw the South Fork, something like I felt when I saw the upturned earth, something like I hadn't imagined was possible, something like love, but more like hope. And the most hope in the story has to do with what this unroading will do for fish and the river, though that's important too. This hope I felt welling like pain beauty tears was hope for the humans who visit this land. Because in the plan that created this change, the forest plan, the plan of land managers, was a plan future thinking, a story written by those who will be seen as good ancestors, even as they will never live to see the result of their work. For though it will take a half century or more for the wound to heal, it will. And there's a chance that another woman a century after my passing, as in love as I am with the South Fork of the Salmon River, will, of a May morning, walk up what she guesses is a game trail. She will follow the track of wolves and bear, the heart-shaped hoofprints of deer and the musk of elk. She will look into the eyes of the arrowleaf, and she will, not knowing all the ancestors looking back at her, she will, I hope, feel the ghosts of others that ask her to stop and look first and east. She will stop near the base of a lodgepole that may be then only a snag, a ghost itself, still stalwart and knowing, and she will lean against it and stare upon a landscape that she would never have imagined a road upon. She will step the edge of the ridge and look in and see what some have called resource, some have called preserve, some have called wilderness, and some have no name for it all except home. And maybe compelled by beauty and not the fear of losing it, she will step to the edge, arms open, head bowed, and the sound the trees and the birds and the river will hear is the sound of her voice saying, thank you. Epilogue. To date, 300 miles of road have been obliterated in the South Fork of the Salmon River. 200 more are scheduled for obliteration. Though it is too soon to tell the effect these actions will have on the streams, tributaries, and fishes below, we can look to old data from the hundreds of miles of decommissioned roads on the Payette National Forest, the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, and others, and know that the work is not in vain. It's important to note, too, that healing the land, at least in the South Fork, was not unlike healing a body. Groups once at odds, both federal and local, tribal and non, came together to heal a landscape, to remove a road, to support a river, to save her fishes. There are a lot of words for this kind of action, from collaboration to community, but whatever you call it, know that names are mutable, as are definitions of words, like love, but maybe more like the definition of hope. We are, as humans, capable of a great many things. The wounds men make in the earth do not quickly heal, writes Stegner. Still, they are only wounds. They are absolutely mortal. Better a wounded wilderness than none at all. Lace your fingers together one more time for another look at the South Fork of the Salmon River. Perhaps you can see it a little more clearly now. The drainages between your fingers, the steepness of the ridges. Imagine it as it can be in 5 years, in 50 years, and see the river as it flows between your fingers, where the round of your knuckles meet, the river that has been carving the canyon of the South Fork of the Salmon River for millions of years. Its stories begin in the rock and soil, buried beneath the mussel beds and rainstorms, cobble and time. You can see it, or start to, if you roll your palms upward. Look how they form something like a basin. Look at how they seem to be giving something away. Look at the life that runs in the lines. It's there. There is the answer. The one I told you was in the bottom of the river beneath the bridge that pauses like a comma. There's what it takes to make a new story. There is where the future of the South Fork, the salmon that is all fish, the West and the future for our predecessors live. There's the geography of hope. Right there, in your hands. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, CMarie. I always love your words, and I read some of your poems to others every chance I get. Your poems and prose for me are a story, have meaning, and help to create change. And because I feel like we have this, such great relationship, you just turned me into a storyteller. So I like that you read about water and that connection, right? That connects us all together. As far away as Saminicum. Saminicum is the Nimi Putempt or Nez Perce word for confluence, where two rivers meet, the Snake River and the Clearwater River. The river also is a boundary between Saminicum, Lewiston, and Tincutspa, Clarkston, which means jawbone and is literally the shape of the inlet. And as our introduction came, Palouse Poo, or the Palouse band of Nimi Poo, right? They lived on the Palouse, Holman, or the Palouse, and the Tahinma Poo, the Fan people, and they live in Moscow, right? Tahinma, a place where a person resides in connection to the land, tells a story of their identity and who their family members were. From Saminicum, right, to the Snake, to the Clearwater, to Columbia River Gorge, and how that water, Poos, connects us. Without the connection to the land, we have no identity. We do not exist. And as like CMarie said, when we heal the land, we in turn heal ourselves. Oh. Let the ancestors, Anaconda, you're Anaconda in the making, an ancestor in the making, CMarie, I promise you. And which kind of leads me into our first question, and that is, identity and place have their immemorial roots in oral histories and languages, right, of indigenous peoples such as Nimipu or Cowlitz or Wayilepu Cayuse people, and the connection to the land. and people are essentially able to reclaim their identity through cultural knowledge and research and oral histories as sources of theories and facts. And can you speak to those knowledges that you teach through your poems, such as a poem to acknowledge the land itself, along with the people whose language, culture, and religion were born of it, is rarely acknowledged, and how this poem promotes action is change through poetry, and why this is so significant?
Wow, there's a lot in that question, Julian, but I'm going to try my best. Oh, I heard the other day a quote that hope is love with its sleeves rolled up. And I really like that because I used to be a little hopeless. I would look around and I would see what was happening, and I would look around to people in my culture and experience what seemed to me to be a lack of care. And the destruction wasn't getting any better, it was getting worse. And I had to save myself. I had to find something to hold on to and something to give me hope. And so I started writing about those places. And for me, story is restoration, is restoration. And so that story that I can tell, that story, the words that I can give that are given to me by that place are building hope within me because of the way they are received, just the way the stories that come from the original people of the land, their stories, their names. I've learned, I've tried so hard to learn Nimi Putimta and get to know the land through its original names. But I've also found the most important relationship was the relationship between me and the beings. They had stories to tell. I needed to get out on the land and get to know that lodgepole pine, lay my back against it, listen to it, smell it, be with it for some time, be on the land and hear the land story and what it was trying to tell me. And it tells it in those myriad ways. You are probably starting to see it now. Here, we see only salmon snow. There's 7 feet of salmon snow here that will tell its story as water, as it melts, as the Cassin's finch have just come, tell me that spring is coming. I think our greatest obstacle to overcome is to break down that imagined barrier between us and landscape and find our stories too within those landscapes, but our stories in relation to, not as taking from. So there's a balance to that. There's a balance that we're searching for, but there's also a need for that hope, because without hope, we're not going to change, no matter what. And there's hope in those stories. There's hope in coyote stories, even if they're goofy. But more importantly, there's hope. Maybe not more importantly, equally as important is the hope that I see in a hillside full of balsam root. It's the hope that I see in young people who are out there sprinkling seeds to grow trees that they'll never see come into maturity. Is the hope that we are starting to think in future generations instead of in just our time now. I don't think that answered your question, Jillian. I think I got off on a tangent.
No.
But there you go.
I love how you make yourself, but I feel like Indigenous people too. We're so progressive, man. Just love that about us. And I really love how you're talking about poetry, but also the landscape of poetry and being an Indigenous poet. I was hoping what do you wish to be? Can you talk a little bit about your journey, about how you came to be? But also I kind of wanted you to touch on that relationship of Indigenous people being removed from the land. And in that in itself, I feel like, you know, as you being an Indigenous poet in Idaho, I feel like there's also some danger like in that, especially with some of the things that your poet, you know, that your poems and your prose embody, like Coyote Story and missing and murdered Indigenous people.
Mhm.
Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think you started kind of with the journey, and when I was asked in an interview recently, at what point did you start to have a relationship with nature? And I was like, well, breath. Yeah. Right there also in my mother's womb, like for me, there was never a nature, not nature. There was always a relationship there. And so that wasn't something I had to create as much as I had to create a relationship. No, that relationship was there just as my relationship with writing. There was never a time when I wasn't a writer and was a writer. At 6 years old, when I got words, when language came to me, I was telling stories and I was writing books. And as a very young person, my first words were very interested in sound and song and telling stories to my mom or telling stories to my dog. So that nature and stories has always been there for me. That journey and coming to Idaho and really strengthening that voice. And I do thank Idaho for that. I do thank this land for giving me that voice because it taught me so much about how to speak. Idaho is such a juxtaposition, isn't it? Like we have so many things just butted up against each other. And what better teacher of poetry than a land full of juxtapositions, full of moments that make you stop and have wonder and awe. So the landscape taught me a lot of that. And the beings on the landscape taught me music. Rivers taught me how to flow words. So much of that came together when I came to Idaho. But telling these stories about landscape cannot be told without understanding how Native people were removed, understanding the stories that were forcibly taken from that land. The people, it's like jerking a beautiful flower out of the soil by the roots. It's so unfair. It leaves a hole in the soil and it kills the flower. Were we not strong as Indigenous people, we wouldn't have been able to reroot wherever we were planted. But the earth, I think, still holds a lot of those holes. A lot of those holes where her first, her original children were rooted. And in those holes, those places we need to go into and we need to do some work in there. And we still see it, Julian. You and I have talked about this. We're still seeing how destruction in wilderness sometimes parallels destruction with Native women. There's reports on this, like particularly near man camps, where extraction from the mine has been extraction of Native people from their home. So those two things are going to be wedded because they were never apart. There was never a time when Indigenous people were not part of the landscape. There may have been a landscape before Indigenous people, but once Indigenous people came, which we know is 16,000 plus years ago, to this part of the United States, we know that once those roots were in, that they had a relationship, and that relationship was significant. And I've said this a lot of times, so forgive me if I'm redundant. I'm pretty sure that we have no purpose on earth, that human beings have no purpose on earth. We're not like ants or wasps or termites. Termites do so much work and they're like, you know. But I think that if we do have a purpose on earth, it was praise and it was celebration and it was love. And Indigenous cultures, both in the United States and all over the world, loved place, celebrated place. Their stories came from place. Their languages were made of place. And I know that there are some Nimiputemt words that sound, is it akak for a raven? Akak? Do I have that right, Julian?
Yeah.
So even the language came from the land. So that separation between Indigenous people and the earth and their homelands broke something. And we're still in the middle of that break. And we're trying to heal it. And until we start to educate people and put the right curriculum in classrooms and make these land acknowledgements something than just some perfunctory statement, the wound will be there and the landscape won't be able to heal. And until all of us as people go out and recognize the land as an equal, as necessary to survival, as something we need to protect and not commodify, until all that happens, hope is going to have a really hard uphill struggle. And so is healing.
Absolutely. I always tell my students that, you know, as Netitula, as the people, you know what I mean, put on this earth, right? We couldn't survive without the animals and the plants, right? We're just babies in the grand scheme of the universe, right? If we didn't have the plants, if we didn't have the animals giving themselves to us, we would die. Literally, we would cease to exist. So
And
I
that's
love
easy
that connection.
Yeah, and it's easy to forget that when we cover the landscape with asphalt and cement and housing developments, and we have less and less of that open to remember where we come from, to remember who we are, to remember what we're equal to. We are more DNA of tree than of Walmart. We need to be close to those relations in order to feel good, to be healthy people, no matter where we're from originally. We're all from this earth.
I love that you bring up that we have, you know, similar structures in our, you know, DNA sequence, or, you know, the structure of our DNA helix, or whatever you want to. Don't make me get too scientific here. But I have to just say this, that biologically, us Netitula humans actually have more in common structurally with mushrooms than we actually do with plants. And the same with mushrooms, they have more in common with us than they actually do leafy greens. And that's why, you know, people say mushrooms, fry them up, taste meaty. So true though. All right.
It
enough
is.
jokes. Our next question is, but true joke though. Yay! Gabriel Davis, and his question is, what refreshes your creative energy, and likewise, what unleashes it?
What refreshes and what unleashes? Ooh, they're probably the same thing. Really being outside is always going to be the number one thing. I just got back from a week at Hell's Canyon, and as soon as I see that gorge, I feel like anything is possible. The landscape, just my brain opens and my eyes open, and then I look at all these colors and water, and there's so much good. I feel so much good, and I have written so many things in Hell's Canyon, on the Snake River, and the South Fork of the Salmon. So that renews me, and I do my best to spend as much time as I can outside, and really away from screens and emails and cell phones and all of that. That really matters to me. What unleashes creativity for me? That's a great question. I always read poetry every morning before I write, and I have a very early morning writing practice. And getting the words of others in my mouth, I read them aloud. I read everything aloud as I'm writing. That really matters to me. I'm a very oral writer. Reading poetry and music, and I can write anywhere. And I think the most important part of that too is getting out of my way. So what unleashes it is not letting myself be a part of it. For me, there's something that happens where that energy flows through me, where everything I've learned is like tea leaves in my brain, and this hot water of the universe is coming through, and I'm there just to kind of collect the tea that happens. So I get out of my way, and man, once I'm on a good story or a poem and the music's just right, when that door opens, just like with this essay, when I started with, this is a story of a road, a river, and that music came and I was out of my way, it's a flood. As soon as I try to come back from that though and think, is anyone gonna like this? Then it, my muse gets really shy, like, why wouldn't anybody? So it's really like just letting her do her thing, and then revision a little bit more comes into it. But yeah, music is so good for me. I love, and gosh, I love anything with music, dancing. Yeah.
I love that this kind of is a perfect segue to our next question. And building off what you just said. So how much preparation do you do when deciding to work on a poem or a story? What point of view or subjects or even the phrases that you want to use?
So how do I prepare for that? I just stay open. I always carry a notebook. You never know when those lines are going to come or when it's going to happen. The biggest thing is again, it's just getting out of my way and letting that happen. So really, and for the morning writing, it's certainly a routine. It's just like anything else. If you get up every morning and you do a certain set of things, then the next thing is exercise. For me, I get up and it's coffee. And these lights, for some reason, have become a big part of my routine. These Christmas lights that I've been turning on since November. And then it's just sitting in the chair, and I open a software program called David RM Software, and it's journaling software. And I start writing in my journal, and that's where everything almost everything I've written has begun that, or if we're out in the wilderness and or in camping and I'm writing in a notebook, in that which I view as a journal too. So I kind of like to fool myself. Like if I open a Word document and I title it like the next poem I'm going to write, I will sit there and stare at white space forever. So yeah. And some things want to come out as poems and some things want to come out as prose, and often they come out as both.
I love that. Our next question, and it really gives a lot to think about too. I still remember the first time that we met in person, and I was just a Riziest. You took me to the most beautiful restaurant overlooking the lake and the water, and I was in the bathroom stealing the expensive toilet paper. So you were such an inspiration so early on to me, which kind of leads us to our next question. How do you use your platform as an educator to advocate for social justice beyond the classroom? And what advice do you have for other educators who want to be more involved in this work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an important question. I never want to tell people how to live their lives. I want there to be room in my stories for people to see themselves and see possibility. That's really important to me in advocacy. There are people that need to shout the words out, and there are poems like Land Acknowledgement that is a little bit more of a drum beat of what I'm demanding. In the prose, I want it to just be a little bit more of an invitation, and to try to see how complex things are so that we can come to our own ideas about them. And I hope that when I show these sides of it, that folks do. I use my platform to talk about things that matter to me. I use my Inlander column, which is a huge platform, to write those stories and write about advocacy that is perhaps, it's an opinion column, so I want it to be a little bit more strong. But the most important thing I want to do is inspire people to tell their story, right? Is to kind of be an inspiration. That's my teaching philosophy. That's part of my writing philosophy. I want I want my work to inspire. And whether that's now or a long time from now. And so when I talk to educators, particularly in Idaho, where hope feels sometimes completely impossible to come by, that we write the stories of the future, that those stories, like, it's a horrible thing that we don't have all the stories of the Native people who lived here. It's a huge loss that we don't have that wisdom. But when we look to the stories that have come after or that are coming out now from Native people, we see someone like Robin Wall Kimmerer writing Braiding Sweetgrass, and we see a future that is possible. We can also look back to problematic writers like John Muir, like Wallace Stegner, and realize that what they did with that writing is huge. Muir protected so much land. Stegner, the same thing in the Wilderness Letter. He started the Wilderness Act. So we have to remember that the work we're doing is like those roads that are being obliterated. We're trying to obliterate some of the bad work of the past and create this landscape of hope. And we do that by writing into a future we want to see. And so in like the piece that I just wrote, I want to empower people to see that it is in their hands, that they can make these changes. These were humans that came together to decide to do something for the aesthetic, for the fish, for the landscape, for the trees and the water, but also the aesthetic of place. We can do beautiful things. We can do hard things, but we have to believe they'll make a difference too. So empower yourselves with story and empower yourselves with the good that's out there, not covering one eye, not pretending the bad's there too, but believing that maybe they're not good or bad, but they're just something that has to change and that we are capable of doing it.
I love that you say poetry is used as a landscape of hope, which totally meshes so well with our next question. Is what does the role of poetry play in inspiring others to defend nature as opposed to like direct prose?
Poetry's sneaky. Poetry's just sneaky, and that's the best thing about it. One of our former poet laureates said, the revolution is coming and poets are going to lead the way. And I believe that is so true, because poetry gets in our minds and gets in our hearts in a way that something with too much pathos or too much logos, I can't. We can look at data and we can discern that, and we need that too. We can need the science, but the poetry can change us, can move us in ways that kind of get past us. Julie, in that moment where somebody's reading a poem or you're reading someone's poem and you're like, oof. And it just somehow it's just either filled you with air or stopped your heart or something, and you're not sure why. That's the power of poetry to change people and to change their minds. And it's significant. We just released this book, Cascadia. Here's a shameless plug for Cascadia. But I believe in this book, or why would I have been a part of it, right? And this book is full of poems and stories and art of beings that exist in a region we call Cascadia, which is a region you and I are in now. And people are buying this book and giving it as gifts, and they're buying it and they're reading it to their landscape, and they're finding a new way to have a relationship with place that they couldn't have before. This is not, we like the apps on our phones to like, what plant is this? And then we learn and we move on to the next plant. Poetry allows us that relationship that I talked about earlier. We have to really look at something. We have to know it to write a poem about it. And that's going to change the poet and the reader.
Yes, I love that. The landscape of poetry as re-education. Oh.
Humanities plus science equals love.
Yes, which is leading us to our next question by Cynthia Elizalde. And her question is, how does your understanding of the land itself and its history inform and inspire your own poetry?
I want to back up to the question about a platform. My writing also is always going to include, when it includes landscape, it is always going to include the full history of landscape, which includes Native people. And that platform makes sure that in every chance I get, when I'm talking about land, I'm talking about Native people as well. So I just want to add that to that earlier question about platforms and how I use it, and why that's important. And so can you reread the other question or
Yes.
this? Yeah, thank you.
How does your understanding of the land and its history inform and inspire your poetry?
I have always been attracted to places that have a presence that was vital and is vital and is sometimes now maybe labeled a ghost town. I don't want to say that a landscape is a ghost town, but a landscape is this place that remains with a history and a people we can't see all the time. And being on that landscape and knowing that people were there with, you know, time immemorial gives me this relationship, not just with the landscape, but with those people. I have thought more deeply about sitting on the ledge. I was sitting on this ledge last summer in the South Fork, and I reached down, I picked up this rock, and I was like, I've never seen a rock like this before. And so I toted it home, and then Caleb took it to the Forest Service, and a geologist there was like, that's chert that's been worked for arrowheads. And it was like, you know, it was big. I'd never seen chert in that size. And so I was like, that was left there by a human having an experience making arrowheads. It could have been 100 years ago. It could have been 10,000 years ago, but I shared that space with that person and that moment, leaning against that tree, or at least having our butt on the same soil. That to me elicits a sense of wonder that I cannot even put a cap on. That just inspires so much wonder. And knowing that, and knowing those stories provide a much deeper connection to place. But also, when I go to that place, I understand its pain. We went to these lakes where the Tukadika, which are also called the sheep eater, were gathered after a very long march through the Frank Church wilderness, where they even killed their dogs to stop them from barking, just to be free on that landscape, just to be free. We went and camped that night at the place where they were held. And I laid there on the ground, and I could hear the women crying, and I could hear the fear and a loss of what it would be to be taken from your home. And so that has changed everything I see about the landscape, and knowing the language and getting to have that connection has changed the way I relate to all the beings, and getting to know the beings and knowing the indigenous uses for plants has changed everything. So all of that together has made me have such a deep relationship. And the Haida culture says that be careful as you step, for the earth sees everything you do. And after learning that, how can you ever take a step in the wilderness without thinking it again? So tying all of that together has made an experience which was once not less than, because I've always loved, I used to sleep outside on the ground at home when I was a kid, and my parents would have to drag me back inside, but has made it so much more important. And so that whole idea of knowing whose land you're on, it's not just a perfunctory thing so that maybe we can, write a 2-sentence apology. It's knowing that that land has so many stories that we can make ourselves so much better by knowing and by supporting those first inhabitants of the land and making sure that they are never not part of it.
I completely agree. Once again, Indigenous people are so progressive. Come on, science, come on, university, catch up with us. Hey. Like I said, you bring the storyteller out in me, girl, shoot. I didn't cuss though, I didn't say the sign word, hey. So we have enough time for one more question. In your opinion, what are some of the biggest challenges of being a poet and a writer?
My
What
first
is that?
reaction, well, if I just wanted to be a poet or writer, my first reaction would be how to eat. Our nation, our country needs to work harder, and we need to find ways to take better care of the poets and writers that we need to tell our stories, our storytellers, our story keepers. We need to take care of them and give them free time and support to write and take care of their lives. So time is always a challenge because it's the commodity that we seem to have the least of and people want the most of. It's always going to be self-advocacy and trust. I had a student recently after she's so close to getting her MFA, and she said to me, she's like, I don't think I want to be a writer anymore. And I asked her why, and she's just like, I don't have it in me. And I understand at this time of year, right before you're about to get your MFA, after you've worked so hard that you just feel spent. But to be a writer, to be a poet, to be anything creative, it requires a self-discipline and a belief in yourself that you cannot learn from a book or from a teacher. It requires you starting a fire inside of you that you tend and you keep up. And that fire might be started in a passion of something that you believe in, like what the things we believe in, Julian, the things that we advocate for, keep my fire going. But it's constantly believing that I can get up, I can write, I can make poems, and that they can make a difference. If I don't have that belief in myself, I'm going to write poems that are walking on shaky legs. They have to be strong, and they have to know I believe in them. Just like we have to believe in our future, and we have to believe in our children, and we have to believe in these generations to come. We have to give them strong legs. And sometimes the hardest part is saying, come on. And so I tell myself, I'm like, I might not be able to run a 5K or a 10K, but I can write a sentence. I can write a poem. And Julian, our communities, Native communities, they let us have that. It's the culture outside of that says that, oh, you're being prideful. But in our communities, if you get a gift, if you say the Creator gave me the gift of poetry, gave me the gift of words, you're proud of it and you protect it. And sometimes that's hard too, is protecting it from a culture who wants you to be ashamed or not to be prideful. And you have to fight for that. And I'll be right here with you, whoever you are. And you too, Julian, with that storyteller inside.
Hey, oh man, I love that your poems create change. I love that they fill us with hope. And so, Katsi Yao Yao, CMarie, I just want to say Katsi Yao Yao, thank you to Brian Varner and Cameron Reed McGill, and our virtual audience spanning from here at the Columbia River Valley all the way over to Seminicum in Idaho. and how these waters connect us, and how poetry connects us, and how the landscape connects us. Once again, Ketsiao Yao, CMarie. And this concludes the end of the Visit Washington State University Visiting Writer Series. And I hope that this reading gave all of you just that much more hope in your own lives. Katiao yao, yo kalo. Bye, everybody. Oh.